Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, the 12th, where we are in our introduction of horror film. Last class, I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline. So, this class, I wanted to talk a little bit about what exactly is horror film and how it can be studied from an academic perspective. So, I had some readings assigned, well aware that people are still adding and dropping. You may not have had a chance to do the readings. Certainly, you can do them after the fact. And in terms of today's class, I also have a documentary for you to watch, which serves as a wonderful introduction to analyzing horror film from an academic perspective. It's actually one of the works that is a companion piece to a textbook that I had ordered for us, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. Do note that the textbook is available on reserve in the GCC library if you still haven't had a chance to get a hold of the book. But when I was discussing the syllabus last class, I didn't really have a chance to talk about plagiarism, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And the way I used to talk about it, notice I'm using the past tense here, is that basically it was using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. So basically, it was a kind of intellectual theft. But rather than taking a piece of property, what you were doing was taking somebody's creation, their language, or their ideas. And it's a pretty serious offense. If you were to be found plagiarizing, you could fail an assignment, but you could also be expelled from the college with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. So it was pretty serious. And I would give two stories, notice I'm still using the past tense, to try to encourage students not to plagiarize. Both occurred in the early days of the internet. So you may be aware that there are lots of internet sites that will assist students with plagiarizing, but there are an equal number of sites probably that will assist professors with trying to determine if students are plagiarizing, such as Turnitin.com, where a professor can type in a sentence or a paragraph and do an electronic search. Well, this first story occurred to me in the early days of my academic career. So basically, I was not able to rely on those resources. I had to rely on my memory. And that said, it didn't take me too long, even though I have a poor memory, to figure out where I had read this piece before as I was going through a student paper. And I realized it was verbatim from our college textbook that I assigned for the class. With a few mechanical errors, I don't know if they were just a sloppy plagiarist or perhaps they were hopeful that if I saw some mechanical errors, I would think that it was their original work. The better story occurred around the same time, so an electronic search was not possible. It happened to a middle aged professor. That part's important. And it appeared in all the academic newspapers. Yes, there is such a thing as academic newspapers. He too was going through a set of papers and recognized a paper and was thinking, where have I read this? Where have I read? And then it occurred to him. He hadn't read it, he had written it years earlier when he was an undergraduate himself in college. It had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling, I guess, papers. But the reality is that somehow, some way, the student got a hold of his own professor's work and submitted it in. I don't think much of plagiarist, but I think I feel sorry for this student. Now, the world has changed dramatically in the last year and a half or so with artificial intelligence. And it's a kind of wild west at this point. I encourage you, ask you, plead with you that you not use artificial intelligence in this class. Certainly, you can use it in other classes if that is appropriate. And I'm not telling you not to use it in your daily life. But I want to explain my reasoning to you. The first is that there are still instances where artificial intelligence is giving incorrect information. In fact, if you look at the notes below under the first section with plagiarism, I've got a link to an article about an attorney actually who used artificial intelligence to put together a court brief and verified through artificial intelligence that the cases he was being given were relevant and accurate, And when he presented his brief to the judge, now this was a seasoned attorney. It wasn't that he didn't know how to do it, he was just trying to save time and effort. When the judge decided to look up these cases using the old fashioned method of books, found that none of these cases existed. So, lots of speculation as to what went wrong. Either artificial intelligence was incorrect, which means that you can't trust it. I've heard some speculation that artificial intelligence was lying. This does worry me. It assumes a sort of level of self awareness that I think is concerning. I've even heard the term hallucination used, that artificial intelligence can hallucinate, which also suggests self awareness and also suggests um, some mental challenges, assuming that artificial intelligence can have consciousness. And I put all of those together and I think maybe not the best resource, especially when I think about some of the morality of it, the work of so many artists, whether they be musicians or they be writers or they be photographers or whatever the case may be. Their work is being used by artificial intelligence and they're not being compensated for it. Because, of course, artificial intelligence just gathers information that exists electronically. And then I think about what are the economic consequences of entire industries being possibly wiped out. And certainly we have a long history of this. The Industrial Revolution is a great example. But this should be occurring over years, not months, not weeks, not days. And the artificial intelligence I'm talking about now will be very different from the artificial intelligence that exists at the ending of the semester. In fact, I read a very interesting article that was talking about some of the mental health challenges we experience in today's world. And obviously, this is a complex subject, but I thought one of the arguments was quite fascinating, that the rapidity of change that we are experiencing as a society is unprecedented, that we just aren't genetically hardwired to deal with change that's occurring this frequently and this quickly, so that we are in constant states of stress and high awareness, and our bodies were never made to be constantly in stress. And that's one of the many reasons why we have mental health challenges in our society. Again, it's a very complex issue, and I don't want to oversimplify. So you put all of these things together, and then the old teacher argument about, and it might sound a bit antiquated, teaching people how to think, to rely on the intelligence in their head, in their mind, rather than on some sort of an artificial or exterior device. Um, and if you haven't seen a movie like The Terminator, I encourage you to see it. This is a movie that talks about how maybe it's not such a good idea when the machines can outthink us. No spoiler alerts here. So I put all of that together and I ask you not to use it for this class at least. And I know that the temptation for all of it is because you're concerned about grades, but I've tried to embed in assessments within this class that you can be successful in so that you don't have to be that anxious about the grades. As I had indicated, we are going to be having very soon weekly journals once we start viewing the actual horror films themselves. That'll be next week. And I'm asking for about a page or so of response, of thoughts or reflections or even questions. And that said, one of the best ways perhaps of putting together a journal is when you are watching a film is watching it carefully, taking notes, annotating, and you can put all of that together as a kind of journal. So by the ending of the semester, you should have a running commentary on all of the films. Just ask that you submit in that journal to me electronically via my email address. That's how my grading program works best, and I will return it back to you. And I'm evaluating it informally. I'm not reviewing it for grammar or mechanics, just for content. Think of it as a kind of conversation on paper. And then there's a final project that we will begin talking about in greater depth over the next several classes. But basically, it's an opportunity for you to specialize or focus on a particular area of horror film and how it is impacting basically popular culture. And there are lots of different ways to proceed with this. You might want to proceed with a typical paper, which I'm thinking should be about 4 or 5 pages long. But That said, you could do something a little bit more creative, such as filming your own short film if you so wanted to. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I mention this because if you hand in that final project early enough, you have up until the ending of the semester. But if you can hand it in early enough, you have the possibility of revision for a higher grade. And finally, the final exam is open book, open notes, an essay exam, which is basically a synthesis of everything we've talked about. So the way to do well in this class is just to do all the readings and to watch all of the videos and, of course, watch all of the films and to watch them carefully. I also teach English classes, as you know, and literature and film classes. We've been talking about the number three, that in order to do a careful reading or a careful viewing, I suggest 3 times. The first, just for plot. What the heck is happening? The second, for analysis. Why are those things happening? The third, immediately before you're going to write about it or talk about it or go to class about it to refresh your memory. I understand that's a big investment in time and effort, but what you'll end up getting is a really detailed analysis, something that's not superficial. And usually, when we watch something like horror film, we watch it for entertainment or escapism. Nothing wrong with that. But in this particular class, we're doing more than that. We're trying to talk about it in terms of its significance in our society. So, what we are going to do is to try to take apart these films the way we might take apart a piece of literature, whether it be a short story or a drama or a poem. Now, the readings that I had assigned, the first was the introduction from the book Projected Fears, and it gives you a little bit of background about what popular culture is. And culture is basically any group membership where you've got a group of individuals, and because they are sharing experiences together, there usually is a predictive element that you can perhaps predict behaviors, values, beliefs, attitudes. It's not 100% foolproof. You want to avoid stereotypes. Not everybody in a group is exactly the same way. But there is some certain element that is predictable. And popular culture is wide um, cultural groups. And usually, when we talk about popular culture, we talk about it from a more disparaging way, that it's consumption for entertainment or for profit, not necessarily for intellect. But I think you can do both at the same time, which is what we're doing in this class. Of course, you have to pick and choose. Not every film or every piece of popular culture lends itself to analysis. Not everyone has depth and complexity. But I would argue that the films that I've selected for this class are very much representations of their time period and have, because of that, a certain level of depth and complexity to them. So, when we think about some of the great horror films in our society, the Frankensteins and the Draculas, the 1930s Universal films, they've achieved a kind of cultural immortality that people haven't read the books upon which these films were based. They may not have even seen the original films, and yet they have a conception of what a Frankenstein is, which is very different, by the way, in film than what you would find in the text by Mary Shelley. So the text by Mary Shelley is not about a monstrosity with a square head with bolts, as I talk about in my Gothic literature class. Um, expect many of the literary elements that you talk about in an English class to be examined in a film class such as this one, such as allegory, these universal stories that basically are representations of truths, universal truths, and symbolic stories, that they're representational, they're abstract. Usually, when we talk about symbolism, we're talking about something that is representational of something that is abstract, something concrete that can represent something abstract, oftentimes an emotion. So take something like patriotism, which is an abstract emotion, but it can be represented from a concrete perspective through, let's say, a flag. That's something that you can touch and taste. So that's a symbol of patriotism. We were taught this. It wasn't like we were born knowing this, but it's a very common symbol that we probably think seems obvious nowadays, though it wouldn't have been obvious at the beginning of our lifespans. And Authors will sometimes use obvious symbols, but not so obvious symbols, and it's the same with directors in film. So we should be looking for symbols, and we should be looking for allegories, these stories that represent universal truths. Um, and I would say that horror film in particular, as the texts argue, reflect our collective fears and anxieties of a particular generation. If you are interested in learning more about this, I recommend the book entitled Danse Macabre, The Dance of Death by Stephen King. Stephen King is usually known for his fiction, but this is a book where he talks about the history of horror, whether it be in text or film or television. And he very much argues as well that each generation basically has its own set of horror films. Horror tends to appeal to adolescents in particular because horror tends to question the status quo and oftentimes deals with the deviant, and that's something that adolescents are trying to do, which is to break free from their parents by questioning the status quo and experimenting with that which is considered deviant, um, at least by the majority group, because the majority group determines normality. It's something that was a quote from actually something that's one of my favorite books, I Am Legend, by Richard Matheson. And it's true that I think that normality is indeed a majority concept. The majority determines what's considered to be normal or abnormal. And the sense of that when we're watching horror or even reading it, that it's familiar, but yet it also is shocking at the same time, is one of the appeals that it oftentimes has. And if it's true that each generation is going to be seeking film, then that particular horror film, then that particular generation will probably be reflected within the film of its time, which is how I've structured this class, that each film represents a particular decade. There are lots of other ways that we could view these films as well, but I did put them in chronological order so that you could see a kind of progression. And then I had assigned for us from the text horror film, what is horror? And that can be difficult to define. Its origins is in the Gothic. I teach a class in Gothic literature, which would be texts that were written starting in the late 1700s. The first Gothic novel is considered to be The Castle of Otranto, written by Horace Walpole, British. And while it's not a very well written book, it establishes many of the conventions associated with the Gothic, secret passageways and mysteries that need to be solved and possible supernatural events. And that's become a springboard for what we think of in terms of horror and horror film. And in fact, many of the famous Gothic texts, as I was indicating, such as Frankenstein or Dracula, are known because of horror film. So, that said, horror can blend into different genres or categories. So, again, if you know Frankenstein, it's studied from a science fiction perspective. The difference being that in science fiction, the idea is that the science could explain the events that are occurring. Our science just hasn't gotten there yet. As opposed to something like the supernatural, something which defies natural order. And horror can talk about both. I've seen Frankenstein categorized both as science fiction and as horror. I also work with Frankenstein in my Women in Literature class, written by a female author, no less. So, and sometimes horror can meld into the fantasy, which is a world that is not necessarily real, but has elements of reality to it. So, some of the elements you can expect in Gothic literature that you will also find in horror film. Monstrosity. In fact, that comes from the Latin monstrare, to show or reveal. And I would say these films show and reveal. Fear, anxiety. And again, usually that's something that people try to avoid. But I think Stephen King puts it very well in Danse Macabre that what he calls it is a way for us to experience these fears as a kind of dress rehearsal. So that when we do have to feel these fears, we have some knowledge and capability of doing so. and that, at least according to Stephen King, and I tend to agree, death is our biggest fear. If you know H.P. Lovecraft, a very famous author in the Gothic tradition, he basically talks about the unknown being our greatest fear, and I would say that those are two of the same, because death is an unknown. Regardless of your philosophical or spiritual beliefs, we don't have physical proof of what happens after death. So that fear, that anxiety that's part of life is something that we can experience in a safe way, because we know we're watching something that's fictional. And there even is a term called catharsis, the purging of emotions, that you might know from, let's say, Greek drama, such as Oedipus the King, and that we can experience that emotion in a safe way. It's almost like the reasons why we ride a roller coaster is because we want to experience the thrill, but we don't want to have the danger that would be involved if we were in, let's say, a vehicle that couldn't be controlled. Now, this threatening of normality or moral order, as I had indicated, normality is a majority concept, but think about how these films threaten that, but that in the end, more often than not, we end up with the status quo. It ends up being very conservative in some respects. Expect to see a figure under threat, often female. Expect possible supernatural elements that could defy the natural world, but oftentimes there's ambiguity associated as well. So if you wanted a more naturalistic or scientific explanation, you might be able to do that. Eerie atmosphere. One of the reasons why I hold this class, the online version of it, so that most people can participate during the fall semester, is because of Halloween. And Halloween is all about atmosphere. Again, those are the secret passageways and the cobweb-filled hallways. Also expect doubling. There's a term for this. It's called doppelganger, the idea that all of us have a double in some respect. You'll see this a lot in horror film and Gothic literature as well, a doubling or even a tripling. So why is it that some of us, like myself, are attracted to horror was basically the next reading that I had assigned, The Why of Horror in Horror Film, Chapter 5. There is a release of endorphins, which oftentimes occurs when you are engaged in things like extreme sports or riding a roller coaster or so forth. So there is a kind of vicarious thrill. Catharsis, as I was suggesting earlier, an ability to purge emotions. And as I was suggesting with Stephen King's Danse Macabre, the ability to engage in deviance and be able to return to a status quo. Now, in terms of scholarship, probably the first person to study horror, or one of the first people to study horror from a serious academic way, was a person by the name of Robin Wood. And he wrote an introduction to horror film. And basically, he talked about how horror films are very psychological in nature, and it talks about that which is repressed within us. And it also talks about the idea of otherness, that which we see outside of ourselves, different from ourselves, deviant from ourselves, is considered other or a threat, a monstrosity, if you will. Now, you might know Sigmund Freud, who is the father of psychology. He had an essay called The Uncanny, which is oftentimes used to examine horror film. And his argument in The Uncanny is that something is considered to be the uncanny, if you've ever heard of the uncanny valley, because it's very similar to reality, but with a slight difference. So we feel a sense of disorientation. And according to Freud in his essay, that when we feel fear, it brings back that which is old and familiar, but also strange. The repressed, much like Robin Wood was talking about. Robin Wood was basically springboarding off of Sigmund Freud's theories about repression. Julia Kristeva, and usually we talk about horror and Gothic from a male perspective. In this instance, we have a female scholar talking about how bodily excretions are oftentimes used in horror film because they are representation of the other, that this is something that's supposed to remain inside, and once it's exposed to the outside, it becomes a kind of other. Barbara Creed, another female scholar, very famous for her theories about female monstrosity, that monstrosity is often portrayed as feminine and female in horror texts. You can see whether we agree or disagree with this as some of these texts evolve. the fear of the feminine, in effect, the fear of female. But perhaps the most famous scholar, yet another woman, Carol Glover, who came up with the theory of the final girl, which you might have heard of before. And this has become cliche now in horror film, starting with films such as Halloween, which is a film that we will view this semester, that basically, after a rampage, the final survivor is female. And while she's strong and resilient, she also has been subjected to great degradation and to great pain. Um, and that said, we could spend the entire semester just talking about scholarship, but this semester is really for us to view this film or these films and to begin to talk about what some of the scholars have said, but also what our own interpretations of the films are as well. And in terms of horror film, I'm probably not telling you anything new when I had assigned horror film critics and censors that it's oftentimes maligned, this genre, this category, and misunderstood. And yes, it could be done purely for profit. Yes, it can be experienced purely for escapism. And yes, it oftentimes can titillate and oftentimes can take things to the extreme merely for shock value. But that doesn't always have to be the case, as we will see with the films over the course of this semester. And that audiences, while they might be viewed as vulgar or immoral or crass or even violent, that's not necessarily the case at all, as we will find when we view this documentary. And the documentary entitled Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. Luckily, I was able to find a link for it online for free. It's an hour and 36 minutes, so I'm going to stop right here so that you can watch this documentary. This is a good introduction to the class. It's on Tubi. And basically, the documentary will be our attendance question. As you know, I am asking an attendance question at the ending of each of our classes. I will post our classes by Thursday at 6 p.m., but I will try to do so earlier. And then you will have an attendance question that will be due 48 hours later. So our attendance question, which I'm posting for this Thursday class, would be due Saturday the 14th. Though if you need an extension, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. What did you think was one of the most interesting things in the documentary Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, and why? So as you can see, there's no right or wrong answers here. I'm more interested in your reasoning, not what you found interesting, but why you found it to be interesting. And you are not required to respond to the posts of your classmates. You certainly can if you're moved to do so, much like in a class you might raise your hand to respond to a classmate. You are, however, required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn, because I will be responding in turn, as you saw with your introductions, so that ultimately this would give you a good idea of the class participation that we would be having. Now, next class is when we begin actually watching the horror films. The first being The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Now, I've posted a link for you so that if those of you who wanted to watch it earlier could, but my thinking is that we'll talk about the Dr. Caligari next class and you would have time to watch it during next class, which is what we would be doing in a face-to-face class. And this is what your first journal is going to be due on, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And much like your discussion forum questions are due 48 hours later, it's the same with the journal. Yes, it's the same with the journal. So if we are watching The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari on Thursday, let's say, even though you might see it ahead of time of next week, then it would be due the following Saturday or the upcoming Saturday, the same date of your discussion forum response, which I will talk a little bit more about next class because you don't have a journal due now. So next class, we'll talk about the origins of film Gothic from the Nightmares book. We'll talk about genreification from the horror film book. And we'll also talk about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a black and white film. And it is an example of German expressionism, which I will be talking about. And again, my hope is that you watch these films multiple times, so that each time you watch these films, you can really understand the depth and the nuance involved in each of these films. So again, your discussion forum response for this week, no journal this week, is on that documentary that serves as introduction. What do you think was one of the most interesting things in the documentary Nightmares Red, White, and Blue? And I read all of your introductions and responded in the discussion forum. In terms of my introduction, I was born and raised in New York City. I attended college in upstate New York, University of Rochester, where I majored in English and I minored in psychology, being absolutely certain I was going to be a lawyer. So you never know how your career goals might change. Because there I am in Rochester experiencing, quote, real winters, unquote. This is what their marketing material said, and I thought that sounded exotic. I realized it just meant that it snowed all year long. But I realized what I wanted to do was to focus on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. So that said, I ended up not going to law school, but to graduate school in a warm climate so I could avoid those real winters, UCLA in Los Angeles. There were no winters. We had mudslides and we had drought and earthquakes, but no real winter. And then ultimately, I graduated, began teaching, and realized, lo and behold, I was starting to miss winter. So I applied to several positions on the East Coast. In my mind, anything on the East Coast would bring me back home. And a school that you might know, Greenfield Community College, asked me out for an interview. And I came out on a very hot summer day. Was very pleased to find out that Greenfield lived up to its name. It was a place with fields that were green. Where I was in California, everything was brown because of the drought, in terms of grass and fields and so forth. And we talked a little bit about my transition here to Massachusetts if I ended up taking a position, which I did. And after all, I was accustomed to winter in New York and certainly in upstate New York, so I should be just fine. And I was assured that the winters here in Greenfield are not that bad. That's a quote. Perhaps these last several years have made that true, but I can tell you when I started, it's hard to believe, but it was in the 1993-94 academic year. It was one of the worst winters on record with cold and snowfall and ice. So I was definitely in for a shock. Everybody was unprepared, but I in particular was unprepared. But I've been here ever since, mostly teaching English classes, but as you know, I also teach communication classes such as this one. And I also teach personal communication classes, such as public speaking, for instance, or interpersonal communication. So that's a bit of my story. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I look forward to reading and responding to what you found interesting about the documentary, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. Take care. Bye bye.